They are schedule.
Hello, art family. For this demo, I decided to do a gouache demo, plein air painting. So painting on location. This is just sort of in our garden, and this is the chicken coop in our backyard. So I'm not going to do any preliminary drawing here because I wanted to be kind of as direct as possible. There's not a whole lot going on in the drawing necessarily, given that this is all sort of in a big cube. So I've got a sort of 2-point perspective cube. And just the way the light was, a lot of what's happening in the image was cast in shadow at the time. So the light's kind of passing overhead. So in the time it takes me to do the sketch, the light sort of drastically changed. So in the reference photo, it's a little bit more lit on the front face because the sunlight was going over my head. But in this particular, in this moment, you can see the front face was in shadow. And so most of it was in shadow, except for a couple pops of areas that had light. So I'm kind of visualizing in my mind the cube in 3-dimensional space. So thinking about a 2-point perspective cube, and in this case, it's kind of the roof shape on it, creating a kind of triangle, and the one side of the roof was getting hit pretty drastically by sunlight. Then there was a kind of edge of that light moving across the top, and then there were little bits of light where the light was hitting the right side. So the side facing towards the light source. So we're picturing this cube in perspective, in 2-point perspective, and the right side's getting hit by light. And the right side's not a solid wall, so it's only those little panels, those little pieces. So I'm trying to kind of close an eye and squint and feel out the composition and the form here without doing a lot of preliminary drawing. And I'm going into it with this approach because it's a relatively simple drawing here, and I know that most everything except for these areas getting hit by light are going to be in shadow. So most everything is going to be here about this value or darker. And so I'm going to just start out kind of in the middle. So I'm putting down like a middle kind of gray, so to speak. And it's cool towards the top. That'll kind of translate to the sky as it peeks through. That initial layer was about 80%, 75% water. So it's quite wet and translucent. But that's the only translucent application I'll use. Part of the reason I can kind of confidently throw down that first layer is because I know that the rest of these layers are going to be quite thick with the gouache. So I'm going immediately from that first layer, which is kind of like 75% water, right into this very opaque, kind of thicker application of the paint. So I'm not using a lot of water in it now, and I'm hoping it will build on the previous layers. You can see also I'm painting outdoors, and the sunlight is on the picture here. So because of that, it's drying super fast. So that's something I have to take account for in the moment. Is in the studio, you have about a minute or two for it to kind of sit there. But here on location, out in the wind and the sun, the gouache is going to dry just extremely fast. Like, you can see that initial very wet layer. It was drying even as I was painting across it kind of quickly, so you can even see brush strokes where it was drying as I went. That's just part of the byproduct of painting on location, and my honest opinion is that you just kind of have to let that sort of be a part of it. Just let that texture and whatever sort of buildup of texture, just allow that to be part of the sketch or the painting. So I'm getting in some slightly darker values, so these are not my darkest values, but I know that most everything is going to be kind of knocked down yet further from this step. So like all the trees and shrubs behind the chicken coop are all in mostly like dappled light shadow, and that moves across the kind of the woods there into the yard, and there's only little pops of kind of brighter saturated color, but most everything is darker than that initial blue. So I'm just kind of establishing a couple key points for the drawing. So instead of drawing in terms of like a contour sort of drawing, like imagining the invisible lines that bind this object, instead I'm kind of closing an eye and squinting at the object, and I'm just kind of hunting the shapes that I see. What are these broad general shapes that I see? So the one shape I want to establish, as a means of kind of an anchor point to the drawing, because it's all drawing. The whole process is drawing to me. So one of the anchor points that I wanted to kind of establish is the lower facing planes. So we established the kind of roof general shape, and then there's a little like outstretch where it reaches out past the little structure, and it's about like 6 inches that sticks out. But that area is catching warmth from the light hitting the ground and bouncing back up and creating a really warm kind of pocket in there. So I'm going to establish that by getting a kind of burnt umber and yellow ochre mix to get a kind of warm yellow ochre sort of wood color. And I can paint in some of those little spots and areas that I know are facing down. And then I can start to establish more of these shapes. So instead of trying to render the coop itself and then the area behind, like the structure behind rather, I'm going to instead think about the negative shape. So instead of drawing the coop proper, I'm closing an eye and squinting and focusing on the negative shape, the shape behind the chicken coop, which is just, some grass and shrubs and stuff that has a lot of dappled shadow. So it's just various levels of saturated, slightly darker green than the blue that is dried. And now that I'm putting these layers down, you can see like initially that blue might have looked like it was going on kind of strong, but now you can see I'm putting down a sort of middle gray green color for these background elements, and you can see it's really kind of putting the blue into perspective in terms of how light that actually is. So I'm thinking about planes, and I'm toggling back and forth between positive and negative shape. So drawing the negative shape behind the chicken coop, which will then expand out to the left side and around into the woods behind it. But while I'm in this area, I'm going to start to break down these planes of these objects to further communicate the idea of what the light is doing. So I'm trying to think through like in this moment, what is the light doing, and respond to that as quickly as possible. Because as you can see from me taking the reference photo immediately after I did the painting, the lighting is just changing so fast. So this painting, I think, took me about 40 minutes or so. And in that time, I had maybe 4 or 3 different lighting scenarios. Every couple minutes, something would fall into shadow or fall into direct light. So I'm not going to take the time in this instance to draw the little detailed texture on the pots with the flowers in the front, or the texture on the ground per se. What I want to do is go for the big broad shapes, and I want to evaluate what the light is doing in this moment, and then try to chase those planes, so the facets of those forms, rather than trying to make a detailed rendering of something. If I spent 20 minutes detailing a pot or the little kind of ferns and heart-shaped plants, I can't remember the name of it, but the plants that are coming out of those pots, if I was to spend the time rendering those things, the light will completely change, and so will the light on the pot itself. So the light is moving, the shadow would shrink, the lit side would grow, the highlights would change, the way the plants were lit would change, the way the chicken coop is lit would change. All these things would change, and also the chickens kind of coming and going. They're just sort of wandering around the yard. So I kind of have to take those moments and try to catch them as quickly as possible here when you're doing a painting like this that's in the moment. So part of what I'm after here is the spontaneity of the moment, rather than a detailed rendering. I'm trying to capture just this moment in light, and not an advertisement rendering for a chicken coop or something. That I'm trying to really like showcase the detail or accuracy even. I'm less concerned with that and more concerned with what the light is doing in this moment. You kind of have to pick the thing that you're interested in, and to me it was the light. So just this happened to be in this moment. Most of the face in the front was in shadow, and then there were these little pops of light, and then the way we have woods over to the right of this, it was casting a lot of long, big shadows across the whole scene. And so it just had most of the scene, the woods behind it, and the ground around it was mostly in shadow. And there were these really intense pops of light where the sunlight is hitting the white paint or the top of the chicken coop. And I wanted to just try to grab that moment, in that moment, before it slipped away, which it does. By the time I get to the end of the sketch, it's completely changed. So we have to think big, and we have to think broad, and then subdivide. So big, broad shapes, and then subdivide. So my goal right now is just, how can I go for the big, broad shapes? I'm trying to elevate that saturation and intensity of the yellow, as well as a little bit of the value, get it a little bit lighter than some of these darker patches, so I can kind of communicate that. I'm also trying to go big, broad, and quick, so that there's just enough moisture in the brush to be kind of soft, so that there's a little bit of a melt in these different facets of green. I think you have to choose the thing you're interested in a sketch. In this case, to me, it was this, the chicken coop and the chickens, which kind of wandered in and out of frame. And I sort of just, when I did paint the chickens, I painted them, they were out of frame. So I just painted them as if they were in frame, kind of pretending they were in front of the chicken coop, which is usually where they hang out anyways, because there's like treats and stuff there. But I'm going big and broad with the shapes because I want to catch this moment as fast as possible. So I know like there's a middle gray that goes through most everything. And then in the moment, the chicken coop itself was mostly in shadow. So I know I can go yet darker for that, and I will in a moment. But first I'm just blocking in the big, broad general shape and trying to leave these strokes kind of suggested and loose. The details will come later, but I know from my own experience of doing quite a bit of gouache painting on location, if you focus on the details too quickly, you end up with a very well rendered pocket, and then the rest of it can fall apart. You don't quite have what I want is a cohesive idea. And in order to do that, I'm going just for the big puzzle pieces, and then we will break it down from there, subdivide smaller and smaller. So this was just sort of a lucky, convenient kind of contrast in that there's a big Japanese maple back there that's very red. So I had that little bit of red that sort of peeks through the mostly green areas back there. So now I'm getting into the face of the chicken coop, which is it's gonna be a little bit different in the sketch as it is in the reference photo. Sorry, because the light changed so rapidly, I wasn't able to catch a photo of the exact moment that I did the sketch. But I was trying to do the sketch, which takes a fair amount of concentration. but most of it was in shadow. And again, I'm toggling, instead of rendering these details specifically, I'm trying to just look for where things plumb and line up, which is to say, if you draw invisible straight lines up and down or horizontally, where do these objects line up in two-dimensional space? And I'm looking for the shapes. So there's like a little triangle there, and then there is a rectangle with a small triangle. There's a little sliver of this color, kind of a teal color. So instead of trying to draw this thing and then color it in, because I don't have time for that, I'm just going for the shapes. My hope overall here is to just go for the broad general shapes here, block these shapes in, and then hopefully, when these puzzle pieces are set down, when you step back from the sketch, you'll be able to read clearly the idea or the image that I was looking at. So up close, it might look kind of chunky and blocky, maybe unfinished if you like things to be more detailed and rendered. But in my own personal taste and style, I like things to be a little bit more sketchy and loose. I like the kind of magic of giving someone A and C and their brain creating B with the information that you've given them. So to get some of these smaller details, I'm switching to a smaller flat. For the most part, I use a 1-inch flat, and then this is a 1/2-inch flat. And I can just knock in a couple little dark shapes using ultramarine and burnt umber, and then favoring burnt umber because I want to give the sense that light is kind of passing through and bouncing around on the inside there. Then switching back to my kind of shadow blue color, I can start to block in the interior of the coop. I'm using the initial wash of that blue as the coop in shadow, the white paint in shadow areas. And so I'm painting in it's the local color of that is like a teal color. But as we get towards the top in the little kind of peak of the triangle and the roof, I am going to use much more yellow ochre and make it warmer because I want to get the sense that light is hitting the ground and bouncing back up into those lower facing planes. Any plane that is facing downward, I'm going to try to illuminate with warmth to get the sense that light is bouncing off the ground and into those downward facing planes. So I'll watch for that on areas that are facing downward and that I am underneath. So like I won't necessarily do that on the rail across the midsection because that's only about it's like maybe 2 feet, I think maybe 24 inches high. So that's below eye level. So if we're looking at this and you're imagining a cube in three-dimensional space in 2-point perspective. So we're looking at the corner of a cube in perspective. And then if you were to draw surface lines on that, going back into 3D space. the band that runs along the base of the coop itself, which sits above like the run area where they can run around under, that is lower than the eye level, so we don't see underneath it. So I don't have to articulate the bottom side of that. I can articulate the front plane of it and the top plane. Those are the planes that we will see. Each of those elements are essentially a cube, and I'm trying to kind of toggle back and forth from thinking about, the thing that I'm drawing here, and also just the cubes in in this case, in 2-point perspective in 3-dimensional space. So like the corner of the whole coop, it has a plane that faces me, which is kind of in shadow, and then a plane that faces out towards the sun, which is mostly in light, except towards the top, towards the roof, where it gets into a cast shadow. And then each of those little rails and components are just essentially a cube in this case, 2-point perspective. If I was standing in front of the coop, then it would be in 1-point perspective. But in this case, we are looking at the corner of this thing. So I'm not trying to necessarily draw the object that I'm seeing, but I'm visualizing as well that cube, kind of like the basic exercise you would do in, whatever, high school, art school, whatever, where you're just drawing a basic cube or a series of cubes in perspective. I'm visualizing that and letting that information guide the way that I think about applying these tones and light. So concision is key to plein air painting, especially I find in mediums like gouache and watercolor, where it's greatly affecting the medium. Oil paint, I guess, is also affected by the atmosphere too, but I feel like it's a little bit more sturdy when it comes to like the longevity of like a long day. Where with watercolor and gouache, I find it requires an element of speed and concision. And so little tricks like this is what I was going to get into, are really important to my process in terms of what I'm doing. So like instead of rendering the little, because there's bark all over the ground here, and instead of rendering those little bits, they're also essentially tiny cubes in perspective as well. But instead of rendering those top plane, side plane, and everything, cast shadows, I'm just gonna flick some texture on the ground. So just a little bit of dark and then a little bit of light, in the hopes that will just give that sense of loose texture, just the suggestion of it. Because all of that is just sort of an ambient noise. I think, kind of like I was saying earlier in this, you sort of have to pick the thing that you're interested in and then try to make all your elements conform to that idea. So you have to ask yourself what you're interested in. In this case, I was interested in the structure of the building and then the chickens, but they move constantly. So like the ground, the pots, the little water garden thing to the right are not really important to me or this scene. So I'm going to allow those things to be quite loose and sketchy, and take my time and focus on the things that I want to draw attention to and draw focus to. So now that we've blocked in everything, I'm going to start allowing myself to render some detail. So I have got enough information down now that I'm comfortable moving into breaking these things into smaller planes, so we can start to take the bigger shapes that we have here and start to investigate those smaller planes, maybe sometimes subdividing the values. So if it's, a middle gray, maybe we can start to divide that into something a little more than just the initial sort of 4-step value scale that I like to start with, at least to get the idea down. So chickens are quite tough to sketch because they move constantly. But the one thing I will say that's nice about sketching chickens is that they move constantly, but they do about 4 poses. There's pecking the ground, looking around, and scratching, and they pretty much conform to the same pose each time. So if you can just pick one of those, like pecking on the ground, which is usually what they do. They scratch and they step back and then they peck and then they scratch, and they sort of do that repetitively and then walk around and kind of fluff their feathers a little bit. But they don't do just a ton of different animated motions. There's a few poses that they do over and over again. So one thing that's nice is in a sketch like this, this isn't particularly large. I think it's 8 by 10. So I can I'm taking this object that's already kind of small anyways, and then I'm shrinking it to this tiny, little silhouette, basically. So the idea first is, for the chickens, the main thing you want is the proportions, and then the planes, and then the whatever details you want. So, big shock, the strategy's the same. It's big to small. What's the big shape? And then we subdivide smaller and smaller from there. So the big shape, the envelope of the object or animal in this case, what's the silhouette? They're they sort of have, if you sketch chickens, they kind of have 3 chunks and then tiny legs. There's like a big base and then a tail fluff and then a head piece that is smaller than you would think. So the key first is to don't make them have huge heads and go for the general shape. And usually when they're in whatever kind of pose they're in, like if they're pecking the ground, you don't see much of the head you see mostly the big bulk of the body and then the tail bit that sticks up. So I go for the broad silhouette first. The Orpington is yellow, so a big chunk of yellow basically with a little tail. And then the Boston Red is red, kind of burnt sienna color. So I get burnt sienna, and I go for the bulk, the tiny head, and the tail. And then from there, we can subdivide. So if that's the general local color, we'll have a top plane facing the light, side plane facing us, and then a shadow plane facing downward. So I can divide it that way. So I can add a top plane to them, leave the local color, and then add a little bit of a shadow plane that might divide off where the wing is, or, depending on which way they're facing. The idea is the same as the Coop and everything, if you're probably getting tired of hearing me say it. Big, and then to small. Big, broad shapes, silhouettes, subdivide smaller and smaller with detail. Once all that's done, you can kind of do the details, but I'm adding the light part now. So what we're doing with the top plane of the chickens and the little water garden and the other objects, and then the top part of the plant vases, pots rather, and then the kind of the side plane of it too that's facing out towards the light, is I'm establishing a language of planes. I'm kind of communicating through the sketch. The upward facing planes are catching the light in this direction. They get this treatment. The plane facing us gets whatever treatment. The plane facing downward gets this treatment. So you kind of establish, and then I can carry that note around the sketch. And now that we've gotten this far in the sketch, I can start to break down the details now. So some of these smaller details, like the plants, some of the areas of the plants that are facing the light, catching the light, some of the areas that are facing, little pockets that have shadow. I can start to do some of those details because I feel like most of the rest of it's blocked in, and the idea is kind of there. So from this point on, it's mostly just subdividing smaller and smaller. We can go a step darker. I still have not have I've reserved my like darkest darks, so just neat ultramarine and burnt umber, and then both of those in 60-40 ratio. So 50-50 burnt umber and ultramarine will create essentially black. And then if I pitch that back and forth, which is 60-40, I can get a kind of orangey dark and then a kind of cool blue dark. So I still haven't established my darkest areas. At this point, I'm still kind of just correcting these shapes and adjusting essentially the drawing of what's here. But there's still some shapes to be subdivided. I've got to do the trees in the background that poke through, and a couple little details here and there, and then anchor this with some really dark darks. So just even looking at the reference photo here, you can see how dark the interior of the chicken coop is. So I can push that a little bit darker, and that will help give some an anchor point for the rest of the values, so that things aren't too awash either in the middle or in the light, or in a certain range of values that if most of the things are in that range, it can kind of take away the strength and the impact of that value. So you want to have that full range of light to dark. So now we've painted the trees and all the little bits and details, and now I can really do some of the smaller details, subdividing yet even smaller to get those little tiny pockets underneath the roof itself, where the roof meets the top, planes of the coop, and then the interior and the little kind of door handles and little pieces and clamps and elements that are on it to give it some size contrast too in the shape, so that not all the shapes are the same. So we'll have some small shapes in it as well to help give some contrast to the overall scene. So we want contrast, a variety of contrasts to help sell the drama in a scene. So big to small, light to dark, red, green, orange, blue. These are all contrasting things that play off one another and create drama, create interest in a scene. Light, dark, that's another contrast. We want to play up those contrasts to create interest and appeal. Well, I believe that is going to be it for this one for this month. So a little gouache sketch just in the garden of the chicken coop. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. In the meantime, happy sketching.